Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are taking a look at Summer 2011, a format that we've profiled a couple of times, and taking a deep dive look at worms. Worms is an interesting strategy during this format because the actual worm archetype itself was a collection of cards that most people discredited because the majority of them came out as super rares and hidden arsenal and were discredited as just bulk super rares and actually a set that was an all foil set. As a result, when Worms actually became competitive, there was a window of time where you could take advantage of the fact that virtually nobody knew the card's interactions. And that's exactly what Robert Boyajian was able to do at YCS Orlando. Robert Boyajian was able to pilot a Worm strategy to the top 32 of YCS Orlando, a deck that we are essentially going to profile card for card today. For those of you who have never played against the Worm strategy, it's actually a little bit more powerful than you may anticipate. The deck has 3 ideal worms that sort of make up the majority of the normal summons. We have X, Y, and Carteros, which can tutor out the X and the Y. In addition to that, though, we have the most powerful card in this deck's archetype, W Nebula Meteorite. Meteorite is easily one of the most powerful cards in this stage of Yu-Gi-Oh's history because if it actually gets to do its entire play uninterrupted, it actually results in a +2, +3, maybe even +4, depending on the situation. So what Nebula does is it's a trap card. And the first thing that does is it flips all your monsters into face-up defense position, or it flips them up. Why that's valuable is if you opened up X, ditching Y, and then revived Yagan, which I refer to as Y, you're able to flip the Y up and then bounce a monster on your opponent's side of the field to their hand. So you basically have it being a pseudo compulsory evacuation device. Then during the end phase, it reflips all of your monsters back face down, and then you draw 1 card for each of them that were flipped face down. So as long as you can protect your worms and have worms there on the end phase, you now get to draw 1, maybe 2 cards. If you have the XY start, you actually draw 2 cards. And then in addition to that, you can summon a level 7 reptile worm from your deck, which happens to be Worm King. Now, Worm King's effect's not overwhelmingly powerful, but it is still a powerful effect where you contribute worms, not once per turn, to destroy cards your opponent controls. And as a result, 1 single trap card does a pseudo compulsory evacuation effect if you have Y set, draws 1 or maybe 2 cards, if not more if the game is in the prolonged middle to late game where you actually have 3 or 4 monsters on the field. Then you get to reset all of these flip effects, which means you get to use Y again, and you summon a big 7-star Worm King. And if you had that really cluttered field, or you just have X and Y still, now you can use Worm King to send off and tribute those worms to continually destroy cards on your opponent's side of the field. If this goes uninterrupted and you actually can do that entire combo, your opponent could all of a sudden say, wow, my opponent just drew 2 or 3 cards, summoned a level 7 gigantic Worm King, sent cards from my hand to the field to the hand, popped all my cards. I have nothing I can do. And what's crazy about this, if you go first, there's very few things your opponent can do, right? They can have their copies of Solemn Warning and Bottomless Trap Hole, but if you went first into that X and the Y play, that Nebula summoning out Worm King is going to now allow you on your second turn to stare down a field that has Bottomless, has Solemn Warning set, and you can just start tributing things up, popping the back rows, then start flipping your monster and taking advantage of the game. So this deck can really go off, especially if it gets to go first, and especially if it opens Nebula. So really one of the coolest synergies at all of Yu-Gi-Oh! For this time period, really. People are playing X-Sabers, people are playing plant decks, Gravekeeper decks. All these decks are awesome in their own way. This deck has this very unique ability to have this unbelievably high ceiling if it draws that trap card. As a result, this deck is going to be very defensive. It's going to have a lot of traps in general. It's going to have Pot of Duality so that we can see these cards regularly and hopefully try to craft a game state where we can take advantage of Nebula. And even if we don't happen to open Nebula, this is a format where Heavy Storm is banned, where we're going to be playing cards like 7 Tools of the Bandit, which was very common in a lot of strategies. As a result, this is one of those decks that can produce a game state and kind of go back and forth, grind things out, and eventually activate a mid to late game Nebula. Even if it's not on that opening turn, it can still be as game breaking if you're able to back it up with cards like Solemn Judgment and cards like 7 Tools of the Bandit. So to me, this is one of the cooler control strategies, and it did in fact top 32 during this format. It wasn't the most popular deck in the world, so I'm kind of curious if we went back and played some of these events, how common a top slot would be for a deck like this, if a much larger percentage of the field actually played it. I legitimately considered playing it at the YCS that took place in Orlando that summer. I remember Paul Clark and my close friend Paul Clark and I, there were a few decks we were considering, X-Sabers, Worms, we were considering Gravekeepers. I ended up playing X-Sabers, he ended up playing Gravekeepers. We both ended up top 32ing, and neither of us ended up playing Worms, unfortunately. So we can't really regret too much about that decision, but I remember we had Worms as sort of a consideration, and this was at a point in time where Worms had never topped before, so it was just solely based on the fact that some of these cards had just been released, and solely based on the fact that we thought that we could take advantage of a field that really, quite frankly, wouldn't be prepared for it. And one of the coolest stories I have is actually sitting in the top 32 area of the room, where they kind of slot you away from everybody else, and seeing Robert Boyajian, who I actually had just met at YCS Edison the year prior, and seeing him with the Worm strategy and kind of freaking out. I played Robbie before really ever meeting him in the side events of Edison. We played this literally untimed, almost 2-hour quick draw mirror match. It was an awesome game. He ended up winning the match. And that was the first time I ever met Robbie before he ended up becoming this consistent player on the YCS circuit and eventually a YCS champion. But I remember seeing him play Worms, and that was where I kind of reconnected with him and said, oh, we played at Edison. Do you remember me? I can't believe you're playing Worms. I actually considered playing that deck. My friend Paul and I had been working on a build. So it was really one of those times where not only is it an event that I remember vividly because of an event that Paul and I happened to both place into the top 32, the only time that ever happened. It is an event where we both actually considered Worms, and it's the event where Robert Boyajian actually topped with Worms, and the second time I got to reconnect with him before becoming much closer friends with him in the next couple of years. Regardless, a little bit of story time off to the side. Today we're going to take a deep dive look at Robert Boyajian's Worm deck from YCS Orlando 2011.
All right, we'll start the deck profile off with the Worms. So we've got 3 Worm Zex, 3 Worm Yagen, and 3 Carteros. So these are really the only Worms worth playing. There were technically a few other ones at the time, like Apocalypse that pops back rows, Lynx that could potentially draw cards if you're able to protect them, but these are the most reliable ones, the ones that most reliably generate card advantage, and really they are sufficient enough to win the game. You don't really need to go overboard. There's technically also Worm King, but we'll get to him momentarily. So if you're not familiar with these cards, they're kind of interesting ones. They're cards that would likely be overlooked because they came out in Hidden Arsenal originally, and then obviously there are the Determina versions as well. But let's start talking first about Zex. So when Zex is normal summoned, you get to Foolish a Worm Reptile monster to the graveyard. Technically, you could send any of them, but you actually want to summon Yagen. When Yagen is in the graveyard and the only monster that you control is Zex, you can actually special summon this and put it face down. When it's flipped then face up at any point, whether that's through flip summon, whether your opponent attacks it, or just some other way of flipping it face up, which we'll talk about momentarily, it bounces an opponent's monster back to the hand, which obviously in a format with a lot of synchro monsters, which during this time period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, virtually every deck relies on synchros in some capacity. Obviously, that's a huge advantage because it can just put something like a Stardust back to the extra deck. Technically, if this card leaves the field, then it gets banished. And technically, this card actually has another effect where if the Yagen is on the field, Zex cannot be destroyed by battle. It's a minor additional effect, but definitely something worth noting. But essentially, it gives you a normal summon that allows you to put a second monster on the field and pretty reliably bounce a card on your opponent's side of the field, monster specifically, to their hand. It also just gives you a beat stick, right? This is sort of an anti-meta beat stick style deck, and having an 1800 normal summon is pretty good. And technically, opening this isn't the worst thing in the world. It's definitely worse than something like Snowman Eater, but they're at least comparable in the sense that, this can definitely target a synchro monster, and then it basically functions as Snowman Eater. And then even if it's not, yeah, technically something like an Alias could attack over it, and that's annoying, but it at least is somewhat of a speed bump with 1800 defense, and maybe can buy you enough time to draw some more ideal cards. Plus, we have Carteros. Carteros is a simple card with the flip effect and lets you search any of your other Worms. So super simplistic, lets you search a deck for any of the level 4 or lower specifically, so we're talking only about these 6. But it gives you this reliable flip summon. As you're going to see when we get to the trap lineup, we do want some flip summons in this deck and monsters that we can reliably set. In addition to that, we also play 2 copies of Worm King. It is going to make up the remaining couple Worms in the deck. Worm King can be tribute summoned by using just 1 Worm. So technically, although it is to a tribute monster, you can just tribute one of your Worms for it. And then it has a non-once per turn effect where you can essentially tribute a Worm to destroy 1 card on the field. One card specifically your opponent controls. You, at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, don't really have a lot of value in popping your own cards. So it is 1 card your opponent controls. You do tribute a Worm monster. Technically, you can tribute itself if you're absolutely desperate. Theoretically, in the most ideal situation, you're tributing off other monsters. But, technically, it is important to know that you can tribute off other Worms. It might not seem great just listening to that effect. You're like, it's a 20 and have a beat stick that has a marginal effect. We're going to talk momentarily about the way you cheat this card into play, and the way you cheat it into play is so unbelievably powerful, it basically makes this deck worth playing. From that point on, we have a few support monsters. We have 2 copies of Evil Dragon Anata. This card's one of the coolest cards ever. It's really also one of the cards that, when you read it, you clearly can tell that it's powerful. It just hadn't really had a home up until this particular format with this particular deck. Basically, the way it works is you have to banish all your reptiles from the field and the graveyard. It gets 600 attack for every banished monster through this effect. And then during each end phase, that includes your end phase and your opponent's, and it is mandatory, you have to pop a card on the field. When you basically summon this card, it plays out a few different ways. One way is you special summon it on your turn. Maybe it's early in the game, you only have 1 reptile, so you summon it in defense, you pop something on your opponent's field, and then during your opponent's end phase, they have the option of either not setting anything or just trying to attack over it. And if you have cards like Deep Prison, it kind of puts them in a weird position. Otherwise, they can just choose to not set anything, and technically you would eventually have to pop itself if you didn't want to just keep eating your own cards. That is an option, though. You can keep setting your own cards and destroying them, kind of putting your opponent in this weird situation where they either can attack over it to just move past this point of the game, or let you sit there and kind of incrementally attack for 600 but eat your own cards. Kind of depends on your game plan at that point, but usually at least 1-for-1s, right? If your opponent has a card in the field and you just summon this on your turn, you either can make it a huge beat stick if it's late in the game and then attack over something, or you can just summon it in defense mode, and then eventually during the end phase, you start doing that pop every single turn. If the game's really slowed down and your opponent has a bunch of cards that they can't really chain, you can summon it, your opponent can't kill it. During your end phase, you kill something. During their end phase, you kill something, and then it goes back to you. And maybe if there's even more cards on the field, you can keep going. So it definitely has that possibility of getting more than just a +1. Then we have a single copy of Honest. As you can see, this deck is entirely light monsters besides the Evil Dragon Anata. So we're talking about all of the important worms. They are all light monsters. Being able to keep your X alive is important with one of the traps we're going to talk about a little bit. And it's a deck that has a bunch of light monsters. Honest was played in a lot of decks during this time period that had that. And then there's one Gen X ally, Birdman. So Birdman's in this deck because it gives the deck a little bit of flexibility into the extra deck. There's also a very specific Gen X Synchro monster that actually has a really weird synergy with this deck, a really just almost flawless synergy with this deck. So we'll talk about that one when we get there. But it gives us a little bit of flexibility, primarily to go into level 7s, right? These are all level 4. So I'm primarily going into level 7s, but you also play Monster Reborn, so it's not inconceivable that you need some of the other levels as well. That is our pretty small monster package. For the spells, we have 3 copies of Pot of Duality. It's a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where a lot of the sort of anti-meta style decks are going to play triple Duality. One of the most expensive cards in the game at this particular point in time. It does conflict a little bit when you open X because you want to not only do the Foolish effect, you do actually want to special summon the Yagin. Unfortunately, you can't do both of these, right? If you have both of these, you kind of have to decide what's important. You can still summon the X and leave the Yagin in the graveyard. Sometimes when I used to play this deck, that would be a thing where you just leave the Yagin in the grave. And if you protected this with Honest or Deep Prison, you could just summon this on the next turn once the Pot of Duality effect has faded away. So it's not inconceivable that you end up doing that play because 1800 is a pretty reasonable attack anyway. But you want to be able to see Nebula, which is the most powerful card in this deck, as quickly as possible. So Warren's playing 3 copies of Pot of Duality, 2 copies of MST. This is a format where there's only 1 gateway. 6 Samurais do have Gateway and 6 Samurai United. This deck's not super shut down by Oppression, but it is useful to have MST in case they happen to have Oppression at a time that's ideal for them. GB is a potential deck. There's a variety of decks where just having MST is pretty good. We're talking about a format without Heavy Storm, so people are basically going to set all of their back row. So you definitely want to have some flexibility there, being able to pick things off. And then basically at the point in time, what we're going to call sort of pseudo staples, cards that were in almost every deck. We have a single copy of Dark Hole, Monster Board, and then Book of Moon, which synergizes pretty well in a deck with Yagin. You can reset it, get an extra additional flip effect. Same thing with Carteros if you absolutely need to get an additional war monster in your hand. But a pretty small spell lineup. A few of them are defensive though, and that defensive package goes along with the just enormous trap lineup that this deck elects to run. So we have 3 copies of the best card in this entire deck, W Meteorite Nebula. This is one of those cards when you read it, you almost have to read it 3 times just to make sure that you understand what the card does. Because when you actually think about what the card can potentially do, if completely uninterrupted in a best case scenario, you almost think this card was printed back then. So we're going to start effect number 1. Change all face down monsters on the field to face up defense position. So it basically has a Book of Taiyu effect for the whole field. Why that's especially good in this deck is obviously when you have cards like Carteros and Yagin, it will trigger both of these. Yagin is the one that's especially important because if you opened up with the standard X into Y, that's what I'm going to start to call these, X into Y, right? Because it looks like an X, looks like a Y. But if you open X into Y and Y is face down through its effect, when you use Nebula, it basically turns the Y effect into a compulsory evacuation device where you get to trigger this effect when you want, not necessarily when it's attacked. So there's one synergy right there. And then obviously with Carteros, it lets you search. Now, theoretically, if you're just going to die in battle, you'd get that effect anyway. But it's important to note that it will trigger those flip effects. From there, if these monsters can survive, during the end phase, you change all your face-up light reptile monsters to face-down defense position, and then you get to draw 1 card for each of them. So let's say that this actually worked out uninterrupted. You go turn 1, send X, or send Y with X, set it. Your opponent just has 1 normal summon. You activate Nebula, bounces it to the hand. They can't interrupt this. So now during the end phase, they both get reset, and now you get to draw 2 cards because you have 2 face-down reptile monsters. After that, if that wasn't already enough, then you get to summon from your deck a level 7 or higher light reptile monster, which just so happens to be Worm King. Which means if this entire thing goes uninterrupted, your 1 trap card facilitated a pseudo compulsory evacuation device, which isn't a +1 or anything, but it's sort of, tempo. It's not card advantage, but it did bounce a card to your opponent's hand. It did waste their normal summon, so you get a tempo swing there. During the end phase, you get to draw 2 cards, so that's a Pot of Greed. it technically resets the Y. So now you can leave this face down, and on an additional turn, you can flip it face up to get an additional tempo swing. So you already get a Pot of Greed effect where you go +1, and you get a Worm King on the field, so you get a +2. So you get a tempo boost, a +2, and when you start your own turn, you have Worm King, plus 2 monsters on the field that you very readily contribute. And what's cool here is you can tribute off the Y, tribute off the Worm King, and even bring back the Y if you absolutely needed to. Or if you wanted to keep the Worm King, you could tribute off both of these. The reason I had to make that point is unfortunately Y has this clause where if the only monster you control is X, you can special summon it. So some of you may have been thinking, oh man, you can go tribute, bring it back, tribute gets banished, tribute. Doesn't quite work like that, but nevertheless, you still get to do basically up to 3 pops if you want. You can tribute each of these and itself, plus you already bounced a card. I mean, just off one card, you Pot of Greeded, got a tempo swing with X, or got a tempo swing with Y rather, and you got to summon Worm King. This is the entire reason this deck was so powerful, and a lot of people didn't know what this card did, so it was one of those cards that could really take people by surprise. That's best case scenario. In a worst case scenario, which is still honestly acceptable, you use just Carteros, you get a search off Carteros, you flip this face down, you get 1 draw, you reset a search, and then you summon Worm King, assuming that you can protect this with Deep Prison and Mirror Force, which as you're going to see in a moment are also in the deck. But we have 3 copies of Meteorite, the absolute most powerful card in the deck, and as I just said, we definitely need to protect our monsters, especially if we're trying to get that Meteorite effect off, because you need to have those monsters on the field during the end phase. So we have 3 copies of Dimensional Prison and 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole to combine with 2 copies of Solemn Warning. And I'm even going to jump ahead to the single copy of Mirror Force, giving us somewhat of 2, 4, 6. Looks like we have 9 different cards that you could classify as defensive under those conditions, which is really good. Looks like 8 actually, but 8 cards that are classified as defensive under that situation, where we need to keep that Reptile on the field so we can get the draw plus the special summon off Nebula. In addition to that, there are some kind of interesting cards relative to the format. We have 7 Tools of the Bandit in a format without Heavy Storm. A lot of decks really relied on traps. Having a card like 7 Tools is really important because it's one of the best out, really, honestly, the only out if you want to consider Solemn Judgment sort of as the 3rd iteration of this, to counter cards like Solemn Warning, plus opposing 7 Tools of the Bandit, which is really something to take note of. This deck also elected to play 1 Royal Oppression, and a card that's really interesting is this deck's version of Icarus Attack. We have 2 copies of Offerings to the Snake Deity. So it's an interesting one where you destroy a reptile monster you control and then 2 cards your opponent controls. Unlike Icarus Attack, that it does need to be face up, so you can't set a monster and then use Offerings, which is definitely a bit of a disadvantage with this deck wanting to rely on flip effects and sort of pseudo flip effect monsters like X and Y. However, it is still a really powerful card, especially if you get some of these effects off already, right? You get to flip this up, you get a little bit of a tempo swing, and now you can tribute it off and basically do an Icarus Attack. You know, Carteros, you flip summon Carteros, you get that search, and now you tribute it off to pop 2, right? That generates card advantage. So just the way Icarus Attack can sometimes generate card advantage out of nowhere, Offerings to the Snake Deity can do the same. Another cool interaction is, as I alluded to earlier, Even Dragon Anata does need to pop every end phase. So sometimes you get to a point where you don't want to destroy any of your own cards. So sometimes if your opponent's been setting a lot, you could technically use Offering to the Snake Deity to kind of quicken it. Likely not going to happen, because if they stop setting cards, you don't even have the targets, but it's definitely worth noting that if you absolutely needed to kill your own Evil Dragon, you potentially could. That doesn't happen a lot, but it is definitely something worth noting. But it gives us a really robust trap lineup, and when you consider the Book of Moon and you consider the Honest, you're looking at upwards of 15 different defensive cards. So this deck really tries to protect that X and Y opening, hopefully getting that Meteorite out, and there's a snowballing advantage from there. In terms of the extra deck, this deck doesn't really go into the extra deck too often. It has Monster Reborn and Gen X Birdman, and then Reborn itself can obviously reborn a tuner, so we do need to have some options. So we have Bryanak and Gaia. Goyo Guardian is banned at this point, so Gaia is just the highest output for attack strength. Bryanak is obviously one of the best synchro monsters of all time. Level 7 is the level that you're going to go into more often than not, so you have an Ancient Fairy Dragon. There were actually field spells in this format, right? Necro Valley, Dragon's Ravine. There were definitely some powerful field spells. We have Black Rose Dragon, right? If we're going to play level 7s, we have to play Black Rose. Scrap Archfiend is the highest attack points with 27 for a level 7, so we're going to include that. The card that's actually unique to this archetype that really didn't see any play in other archetypes was Gen X Ally Triforce. So this card requires a Gen X tuner, which of course Gen X Ally Birdman is a Gen X tuner, and then it gains an additional effect dependent on the attribute of the monster that you use to synchro summon it. If you use a light monster, it adds an additional effect that actually synergizes perfectly with this deck, where you can special summon any light monster in your graveyard into face-down defense position. That can range anything from a Worm King, who unfortunately only has 11 defense, but it also synergizes with your flip effect and your pseudo flip effect monsters. So in addition to putting a 2500 body on the field, you can actually bring back the Y or the Carteros, and they flip them face down when they're summoned off of Triforce. So it actually allows you to use these flip effect and pseudo flip effects again. So that's something that likely will happen in very many games, but definitely a cool synergy that specifically is facilitated by the fact that Birdman is, of course, a Gen X tuner. From there, we're going to go into level 8s. We just have basically the best level 8s. Stardust, Scrap Dragon, Colossal Fighter, right? This deck's not likely going to go into them, but it's definitely worth having. This deck is going to play Cyber Dragon in the side deck, so we definitely need multiple copies of Chimera Tech. I could even justify going up to 3 copies. There are 2 Cyber Dragons in the side deck, but plus Monster Reborn, right? You definitely, in a deck that doesn't really access the extra deck, might want that additional flexibility, but there's only going to be 2 here. This deck is going to side deck a copy of Super Poly. In retrospect, I don't think that's the greatest strategy against hero-based decks, but it's definitely something that some people did. As a result, we need to play each of the elemental heroes that were out at the time. So we have Absolute Zero, Gaia, and The Shining. And then the final card, some of these decks actually played Future Fusion. I don't think that that was a very good strategy, but technically Worm Zero is another card that this deck could play. The thing about Worm Zero is even if you don't play Future Fusion, you can even Super Poly it under some circumstances and at least put a unique monster on the field, right? It's not exactly the most powerful card in the world, but it is definitely something worth noting. But that gives us a 15-card extra deck. We're not going into it a ton, but there's definitely some justification for a lot of these inclusions. In terms of worrying about the format itself, so technically at YCS Orlando, the deck that won was a zombie deck. I don't think I've actually pointed that out yet, but I probably should. There's obviously X-Sabers. I'm talking about Orlando specifically because that's the deck that Robert Bayajian got a top 16 finish with Worms. Although, you know, technically you could play this deck later on into the format. I am kind of centering it around that specific event, though, again, a lot of the decks even included in my pile, like, for example, Agents wasn't out yet at YCS Orlando. It would be out later on in the format around YCS Providence, but nevertheless, you know, still within that same time frame. But here are some of the decks that you could worry about playing against. There is, of course, the zombie deck, like I commented on, X-Saber, which was my favorite deck for the duration of the format, really, for the majority of the format up until Tengu really took off. And the plant decks really took off by the end with the release of Reborn Tengu and sort of the strategies around Tengu plants that blossomed at Nationals. There's Agents, there's TG. This deck won Nationals, and of course it top 16 at Orlando as well, so it was definitely a deck that you consider playing against. It's an anti-meta deck. Already commented on the plant strategy at the time. Infernity's not for me, but it got second place at Providence, so definitely worth commenting on. The deck that I actually played in Nationals this year was Gravekeepers. Plenty of them top 16 Orlando. My good friend Paul Clark top 16 Orlando with it. Technically, Six Samurai, even with one Gateway, was a deck. It had a lot of high finishes. It won the very first YCS of the format. Sean Covert won with this deck. Plenty of top 16, top 32 finishes throughout the format. There was some Swap Frog-based decks, both Frog Monarchs, Gen X Undying Synchro decks, kind of a variety, even Fish FTK decks, or rather Fish OTK decks. Couldn't really FTK, so we'll call it OTK. And then, of course, there is Dragoonity. You maybe even could justify throwing some like a Machina Gear Frame out there just because, you know, those good stuff decks during this time period that maybe previously were things like Warrior Toolbox. A lot of times that just looked like a sort of anti-meta machine-based strategy, which is actually to an extent why Robert elected to play a couple copies of Cyber Dragon. It's also good against decks like GBs. I don't think GBs were that great. That's why I didn't include them here, but maybe you could throw them in there as an additional potential deck. You know, Cyber Dragon with the attack threshold has always been pretty good. A couple copies of Jaugen. Now, against a deck like the Gen X deck, summoning this can really stymie their game plan, especially with all the traps in your deck. And in addition to that, it's also a light, so it synergizes with Honest. So I could totally understand playing that against some of the really, really, really special summon-centric decks. This card is really narrow, but it actually does have some inclusion purposes, right? It's good against heroes, which I actually realize I don't have position down here. I probably should throw something hero-related out there. But it's good against heroes. It's also good against Six Samurais. Being a warrior in both of those cases, this deck can really shut down those with a Kinetic Soldier, right? You put Kinetic in defense, it plays around Solemn Warning. It's really difficult for those decks to deal with it. Then we have a couple of copies of Nobleman of Crossout, which is a decent inclusion against decks, even like X-Sabers. You know, if the X-Saber player knows that you're playing this, sometimes they can play around it, but by and large, it can be really difficult to play around it because sometimes you just want to set cards like Dark Soul. You don't always want to just summon Dark Soul in attack mode. And same thing with Emmer's Blade, same thing with Pashul even. Sometimes these monsters are just more ideal in defense mode. So we can include that here. I'm going to put down an Honest and say that this is Hero Beat. Even though I never really loved Honest in Hero Beat, it was a very, very common inclusion in Hero Beat. So that will represent Hero Beat. I feel like oh, here we go. Boom. Gemini Spark. I knew I had one in my giant pile. There. Heroes are represented. I feel like I'm obligated to comment on them. Speaking of heroes, Super Polymerization was there primarily to counteract the heroes. I don't really love that strategy, but it was something that a lot of people did. Then we have a few other interesting inclusions. We have, before these cards really took off in massive popularity, I think if we went back and played some of these formats, we would play these cards a lot more. But Rivalry of Warlords, this deck is a primarily worm-based strategy, so you can basically play the entire game without ever having to worry about Rivalry, and you can shut down things like the plant deck especially, and even some of the other strategies get shut down by Rivalry of Warlords. So it's definitely a cool card. We have a couple copies of Chain Disappearance. I don't really love this card in retrospect, but a lot of people did love this card against cards like Debris Dragon. So there's Chain Disappearance, which is pretty popular. And then a couple copies of Chain Whirlwind. So Chain Whirlwind is an interesting card. It's not a card that really saw a lot of play, but it was definitely a card that had some potential throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So Chain Whirlwind is an interesting one. It relies on another card activating that destroys a card. So whenever you can only activate it when a card on the field is destroyed on either side, and then you basically get to pop 2 back rows. In a really drawn out game, this card synergizes well with some of the deck cards in this deck, like Anada, for example, right? If you're just sitting there with Evil Dragon Anada and your opponent has a bunch of back rows, Anada has to pop during every end phase that activates a card, obviously, that destroys something on the field, and then you can go Chain Whirlwind and pop 2. In retrospect, I don't think it was all that great, but Rava Bayajan elected to play it in his side deck. A card that always had a little bit of potential. You know, anytime your opponent destroys anything, you can activate it. It also allows you basically to stack your effects, so you can go like MST, and then after MST resolves, you can activate this, so it basically turns MST into triple MST, thus the name kind of Chain Whirlwind, right? It kind of implies just magnifying the effects of back row destruction. It allows you to go, you know, a card like No Metagrosso technically destroys, Jowgen technically destroys. I mean, there's a lot of cards in the deck that can technically destroy. Offerings of the Snake Deity destroys. Anada destroys, like I already commented on. So Scrap Dragon, it just gives you this interesting flexibility where if something happens, you can kind of magnify the back row destruction. Not something I love, but definitely something that is worth considering. If I were to kind of revamp this deck, which as of right now is exactly what Robert played, if I were to revamp it, I would definitely take these out. Maybe even play more Floodgates. But nevertheless, thank you for watching. It's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.